everybody, episode 727 of the podcast, and Assuming America, the Torres Sports Podcast, presented by Betfred Sportsbook. It is Monday, June 27th, 2023. People, I hope everybody's doing well. I hope everybody is having a great Monday. I hope everybody is ready for what should be a fun episode of the Aaron Torres Pod. Final week of June. Where did spring go? We're in summer, and we have a loaded, fun show for you today here on a Monday. We're going to open actually with a little bit of college football. So Betfred Sportsbook, our presenting sponsor, you see that lovely banner in the background. They have released their week 0 and week 1 point spreads. You can go to the Betfred Sportsbook right now and bet these games. And so what I want to do today is kind of just look through the big games of week 1 and week 0 and just talk them through with you guys. Now, I do have a best bet, but this isn't a betting segment, just kind of talking through what are the big week 1 games, what do you need to know about Ohio State and Penn State and whomever, Colorado, TCU, Florida, etc., and just talk through the week 1 games with the point spreads courtesy of Betfred Sportsbook. From there, we will do a little basketball. It was interesting. I get asked all sorts of questions all the time about hoops. One of them, Torres, who do you think is the best coach in college basketball right now? I bring it up because I put the question on Twitter on Sunday morning, and I got a ton of response. So we're going to react to your reactions to the question. And then, of course, we will wrap with the story of the weekend. The one, I should be a consultant at West Virginia. I told them a week and a half ago, hire an interim head coach. You're going to lose all your players to the portal. Well, it took them a week and change. They have hired an interim head coach, but is it too late with 3 West Virginia players, as I record, currently in the portal? So busy show, fun show. But with that said, let's get to the topic of the day. And the topic of the day, I'll just say this, is that I have always deemed, we've talked a lot of college hoops on this show into the spring and into the summer. And the reason is that I think the college hoops calendar has been extended with the portal. But I have always said that in my opinion, the NBA draft is almost like the end of the fiscal year for college basketball, right? Is that we have the preseason, the regular season, March Madness, then we have portal season, then we have the NBA draft, and that's kind of the last real thing college hoops related. So it's always at this time that I really start to ramp up the football coverage. And at the same time, while I haven't talked a ton of football, the plan has been to talk more football the last couple weeks, but something basketball related always happens, whether it's the West Virginia craziness, Bob Huggins this, who's going to replace them, transfer portal, NBA draft, whatever. But I do want to get to some football on today's show, and it's fitting because both it's kind of time to start talking football, but also our presenting sponsor, the Betfred Sportsbook. You can see them right here in the background if you're listening to this show or if you're watching the show on YouTube. They have put out week 0 and week 1 lines for college football. You can download the Betfred Sportsbook app right now and bet on Utah, Florida, on LSU, Florida State, all the big games in week 1. And so what I want to do over the next 5, 10, 15 minutes, I do want to talk through the big games of week 0 and week 1. I do have one official bet in the Betfred Sportsbook, one best bet for week 1. And we'll just have some fun. And I want to use this as kind of a two-pronged thing. Is 1, talk a little betting, but 2, really use this segment to just start to get everybody caught up on what happened in college football last year. It's a crazy world. As I said, I have started my prep, and there's a lot that has happened since last season. So catch you up on what the big storylines are, what the big narratives are, but then also do it in the, in the betting form, betting background, whatever. By the way, I should mention we will run this segment on the college football betting feed, which will ramp up as we get closer to football. So let's talk a little college football with the week 0 and week 1 betting lines, courtesy of the Betfred Sportsbook. What I would say, week 0 has become a very interesting time in college football. Traditionally, we have that one Big Ten game. Big Ten has kind of put their stamp on week 0. Last year it was Nebraska Northwestern. The year before it was Nebraska Illinois. And so this year there is no Big Ten game to speak of necessarily. But the big intriguing week 0 game, those are those 2, 3, 4, 5 games before the big build up to Labor Day weekend. The big week 0 game is Notre Dame playing Navy in Ireland. Now, Notre Dame does enter that game as a 20-point favorite in the Betfred Sportsbook. And let me just tell you this. I think this is one of the most intriguing early season games. I'm also just going to be blunt. This is not one that I will be personally betting on. And if you've never heard me talk betting, by the way, I like to talk betting, but I'm not going to lie to you and say, take Notre Dame minus 20 just because. Like, no. If I don't have a strong opinion, if I'm not going to put my own hard-earned money on things, then I'm not going to tell you to do it either. And so I bring it up because this is why that game is so intriguing to me. Notre Dame, again, a 20-point favorite over Navy in week 0 in Ireland. It's because Notre Dame is a fascinating program to me right now, and really a fascinating program, not only in where they are, but what they've been and what they could potentially be in the portal era. What do I mean by that? Notre Dame, listen, a little bit of a backslide last year, year 1 under Marcus Freeman. But historically, they've been a very good program over the last 8, 10, 12 years since Brian Kelly got it rolling. The problem with Notre Dame has been this. They've been great on the offensive line, usually very good on defense, usually have a game breaker at running back. They have never had elite quarterback play during any part of this entire era of the last 10, 15 years. And you would think quarterback should be the place that they're able to recruit at an elite level. Yet it hasn't happened. And why Notre Dame is so interesting this specific season, they finally got themselves a real quarterback. If you remember, Sam Hartman, 4-year starter, I believe he played the last 4 years, 5 years at Wake Forest. This guy was quietly one of the most prolific quarterbacks in ACC history over the last couple of years. 38 touchdown passes last year. And oh, by the way, he was injured to start the season. 39 touchdown passes the year before. Now he is at Notre Dame. And it just makes Notre Dame absolutely fascinating coming into a crucial year 2 under Marcus Freeman, where they have a fascinating schedule in their own right. Outside of this big Navy game that I said to start the season, remember, it is in, I think it's week 3. They play Ohio State at home, which will be a fascinating early season test. It's actually week 4, forgive me. It is the last full weekend, or it's whatever. September 23rd, they play Ohio State at home. They also play USC at home, and they play at Clemson. And so I just bring it up because Notre Dame is a fascinating team with a loaded schedule, but they finally have a quarterback. Now, again, this is a game I won't be betting, and here is why I won't be betting. Navy, for the first time since 2007, has a new head coach. Remember, Ken Niumatalolo struggled the last few years. He gets let go. A new staff is in. Now, the reports are they are keeping that triple option offense, but I have no idea what to expect. Now, I know some of you do like to gamble, do like to throw money down, like to have a little action on all these big games. I'm staying away from that one in week 1, but Notre Dame, watch out for Notre Dame. They have a real quarterback. Absolutely fascinating to follow. Outside of Notre Dame Navy game, I'll say this. Week 0, there's not a ton going on. USC plays, of course, in true Pac-12 fashion. They're playing on the Pac-12 network against San Jose State, so nobody's going to be able to see it. Oh, I don't know Pac-12. You're trying to survive as a conference. You have the reigning Heisman Trophy winner in a year before he goes to the before USC goes to the Big Ten, and he goes to the NFL as the number 1 pick. How about you put them on TV where everybody can see it? Instead, USC will play San Jose State. They are a 31-point favorite going into week 0. Fortunately, though, most of us will not be able to watch it. Let's get to week 1, because I will say week 1, a lot of very interesting games, and frankly, a lot of very interesting point spreads in the Betfred Sportsbook. The first game, that first Thursday night, remember, Labor Day weekend, we get those games really ramping up on Thursday, then we get them Friday, then we get them Saturday, Sunday, into Monday. Thursday, we got ourselves a doozy as the Florida Gators travel to Utah to play the Utah Utes. And if you remember last year, this was a major week 1 game. If you remember, Utah went to the Swamp. That was the Anthony Richardson coming out party, if you will. The game where people were comparing him to Cam Newton and Vince Young after that game. Now, I don't know if I would have done that, and I certainly didn't do that, but Florida gets the win. And I'll be blunt, that was largely the high point of their season. Really struggled from there, and it shows you how big of a rebuild that Billy Napier has when you look at this point spread. That is because in the Betfred Sportsbook, Florida is currently, how about this? A 9.5 point underdog. A 9.5 point underdog to Utah in Rice-Eccles Stadium in Salt Lake City on that first Thursday of the season. And that number actually kind of feels kind of right to me. Listen, I'll say this for Florida. I actually believe in Billy Napier. We talked a little bit about his recruitment last week and Aaron right, Aaron wrong. I think he's a good coach. I think he's very organized, very structured, very detail-oriented. And I do think he's building a very solid foundation with the Gators. As I said a few days ago, he currently has the number 3 recruiting class in the class of 2024. But this is a process, and this is going to take time. And I know I'm doing the thing that everybody does with a first and second year head coach. I don't think he inherited that much from Dan Mullen. And I kind of blame Dan Mullen for the mess that Florida kind of currently finds itself in. Coming off a 6-7 season last year, if you remember, lost to Oregon State in the bowl game. And right now, Florida's roster is just not where it needs to be to compete at the highest level, as you can tell by being almost a double-digit underdog at Utah. You look at Florida. Here's the concern. Weren't able to really get the guy that they needed in the transfer portal either of the last 2 seasons. And now they're likely going to enter the season with Graham Mertz as their starting quarterback. Do you guys remember who Graham Mertz is? You guys and girls, do you remember who Graham Mertz is? Multi-year starter at Wisconsin. And really, I hate to say it, I hate to be rude, but you can kind of directly correlate when he took over as quarterback to the program slowly declining to the point that Paul Chryst ended up getting fired in the middle of the season last year. 2 years ago, he was awful. 10 touchdowns, 11 interceptions. Last year, he was a little bit better, 19 touchdowns, 10 interceptions. But he's a 59% completion percentage guy. And I don't think he was good enough to start in the Big Ten last year. And I definitely don't think he's good enough to start in the SEC. So you add him in to a roster that is rebuilding the entire offensive line. Skill position guys are good, but not elite. I think Florida's going to struggle all year. And at some point, we're going to do the over-under win totals. Florida's over-under coming into this year is 5.5 wins. Shows you how much of a struggle it could be this year. I do trust Billy Napier in the big picture. On the flip side, that Utah team has sort of a lot of question marks as well. Really phenomenal program coming off a second straight Pac-12 title. If you remember, played in the Rose Bowl 2 years ago against Ohio State, played in the Rose Bowl last year against Penn State. Here's my concerns with Utah. Really like the program, really like the stability, really like the defense this year. They were a top 25 defense a year ago. Their starting quarterback, Cam Rising, is coming back for a 6th year of eligibility, but he tore his ACL in that Rose Bowl. Don't know what percentage he will be at. Certainly don't know here in June. Now, check back with me August 29th. We'll see. But I bring it up because there's a lot of question marks with that and with that whole situation. And so you take that, and then you keep in mind that Utah also lost its top 2 running backs, obviously an elite tight end in Dalton Kincaid, an early round NFL draft pick. This is another one that I will probably stay away from. If I had to actually bet it, I would expect a low-scoring game at Rice-Eccles Stadium. Now, we don't have an over-under yet out from the Betfred Sportsbook. I just bring it up to say that if I was going to eventually bet this game, I'd wait for the over-under and probably take the under. Let's keep it going, okay? Because I did tell you at the beginning, I said, I got one best bet for week 1 of college football. So let's go to that best bet. It is the big noon kickoff game where the reigning national runners-up. Remember, last year, who was the national runner-up? Wasn't Alabama, wasn't USC, wasn't Michigan, wasn't Ohio State. The TCU Horned Frogs are your national runners-up. And here's the thing. They're the less interesting team in this debut game of week 1. Big noon kickoff is in Fort Worth for TCU playing the Colorado Buffaloes and Coach Prime, Deion Sanders. And as I just said, I do have a week 1 best bet for college football right now here in late June, as TCU is a 20-point favorite going into this game. And I'm actually going to roll with, drum roll please, I am going to roll with the Colorado Buffaloes to cover the 20 points as nearly a 3-touchdown underdog. And first off, let me say this about Coach Prime, okay? Because of who he is, because of what he's about, Coach Prime just creates so much interest in everything he does. this many players entered the portal, this many players committed, he's bringing this guy, he recruited that guy, all that good stuff. Well, keep in mind a few things. One, I see a lot of people saying, oh, he's never going to win, blah, blah, blah. He won 22 of his last 25 games at Jackson State. That is freaking absurd, okay? So that's one. But beyond that, think about this Colorado roster. First off, his son, Shedeur Sanders, is the starting quarterback for the Colorado Buffaloes. And you can criticize Coach Prime for this, that, the other thing. Shedeur Sanders is a legitimate NFL prospect at the quarterback position, was phenomenal a year ago, over 70% at Jackson State, completion percentage. And I know, oh, it's Jackson State. And it is. It's a different level. I get it. This guy was also being pursued. He is an NFL draft prospect. This was a guy that had offers from places like Alabama coming out of high school, committed to Florida Atlantic, played at Jackson State. Really good quarterback. And here's the other thing. At the very least, Coach Prime has brought in a ton of skill position talent. Now, I understand that talent isn't on par with Georgia or Alabama or even probably Oregon or USC. I do think Colorado is going to be able to score points, though. Remember, think about the guys that are going to be playing at the skill positions. Travis Hunter, maybe the best athlete in college football, going to be playing both sides of the football. Jimmy Horn was all AAC at South Florida. They brought in 4 4-star recruits that are going to be able to touch the ball. Dylan Edwards at running back was committed to Notre Dame. I don't know what Colorado's win-loss record will be. I'm going to break down their schedule a little bit later in the summer. But they are going to be able to score points on people. I don't know how much they're going to be able to stop them. And then here's the other thing from the TCU Horned Frogs perspective. Listen, TCU was an amazing story last year. Awesome story. But can we call a spade and say a lot of things go their way? First off, let's not forget, Max Duggan wasn't even the starting quarterback coming into the season last year. He was the backup. Chandler Morris won the job. And it was after an injury to Chandler Morris that Max Duggan came in, lightning struck, and he had a ton of success as that quarterback. Now, the good news is Chandler Morris is back. Bad news is Max Duggan is gone. So is their leading rusher, Kendre Miller. So is their leading receiver, Quentin Johnson, a first-round NFL draft pick. Beyond that, as great as the TCU story was, can we also acknowledge something? I hate to use the word luck. Luck is probably not the right word when it comes to TCU. That's not what I'm saying. But let's look at their win total from last year. 13 wins. That included an 8-point win over SMU, a 7-point win over Kansas, in which they scored the final touchdown with under 2 minutes to go, a 2-overtime win at Oklahoma State where they trailed by double figures, a 7-point win at Texas, a 1-point win against Baylor where they kicked a walk-off field goal to win the game, a 6-point win over Michigan in the college football playoff in which they had 2 pick sixes, otherwise easily could have lost. And so it's not to criticize TCU. It's to say that they won 6 of their 13 games by a single possession, and at some point, things are probably going to skew the other way. I bring it up to say that is your official on June 27th, June 26th, whatever it is, your official week 1 best bet. I like that Colorado team to go to TCU and keep things close. TCU probably wins, but I think Colorado covers. Let's keep it going with a couple more Saturday games, and then we got a big one on Sunday that has to be discussed. First of all, Saturday, very interesting. Remember, this season is the debut of, how about this? Drum roll, please. Dun, 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 dun. You know that music? It used to be the SEC on CBS, and at least for one more year, it is the SEC on CBS. But guess what? This year also starts the Big Ten on CBS. Can you feel the pageantry? Can you feel the excitement? Dun, 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 dun. But instead of Nick Saban and Kirby Smart, you get Brent Bielema and Wisconsin. How about that? Let's go, baby. Brent Bielema, baby. Okay. I bring it up to say the debut of Big Ten on CBS. Now, SEC will still be on CBS for one more year before it goes to ESPN. But the debut of the Big Ten on CBS, how about this? Ohio State going to Indiana. Ohio State, a 27.5-point favorite in the Betfred Sportsbook. Now, listen, Ohio State's going to win this game. I don't think there's any doubt. Indiana was 4-8 last year. They had one of the worst defenses in college football. believe the stat was 118th nationally in yards per game allowed, gave up 34 points per game, 449 yards per game. So they're not very good. Ohio State, though, is the interesting one because Ohio State sort of the pieces are sort of there, but the pieces sort of aren't. Defense should be really good. JT Tuimoloau on the defensive line, Jack Sawyer on the defensive line, very good secondary. That defense should actually be improved. The concerns are twofold. One, how good is the O-line? Added a bunch of dudes through the portal this year. And two, what's going on at quarterback? Kyle McCord is the favorite, was the starter in the spring. Devin Brown, his backup, was out during the spring. So we don't know who the quarterback is at Ohio State. Now, I will say in week one, I don't think it affects them, if only because they're just going to have so much talent. Remember, Marvin Harrison Jr. back at wide receiver, Emeka Egbuka back at wide receiver, both caught over 1,000, both had over 1,000 yards receiving a year ago. Don't think Ohio State loses this game. I would probably lean on them to cover. I do think this will be an interesting preview of what to expect from Ohio State. Remember, the schedule is actually pretty tough this year. They have at Notre Dame, as I said a few minutes ago. They have at Wisconsin. Remember, Luke Fickell is now the head coach at Wisconsin. And they also have Penn State at home, Michigan on the road. And we know their season will be defined by those 4 games, but really those final 2 games, especially the Michigan game. I do think Ohio State gets the win and probably the cover in week 1. But how about that? The debut of the SC or the Big Ten on CBS, Purdue, Illinois, Minnesota. Can you feel the excitement? One more game from the first Saturday of college football, and it's actually the same theme. Remember, with the new Big Ten schedule, you get the big noon kickoff game at noon Eastern. Then you get the SEC or the CBS game at 3:30 Eastern. And then you get the NBC night game. And the first one is West Virginia against Penn State. Penn State, a 20-point favorite in the Betfred Sportsbook. That game, again, a night game in Happy Valley against West Virginia. Now, from the West Virginia perspective, I'll say this, man. You know, everybody, when Neil Brown, their head coach, got hired, everybody loved it. And I had no super strong opinions about it. But he just was the guy that everyone said, okay, he's going to figure it out, all that good stuff. It hasn't worked out. West Virginia is coming off a 5-7 season. And what's interesting to me about West Virginia, I remember saying this in the preseason a year ago. I said, we're heading into what is now year 5 of the Neil Brown era. But I don't know, like what is West Virginia football's identity over the last 5-6 years? They don't have one. It's a fascinating program, historically great, all that good stuff, but not like some crazy elite pass offense, not some crazy elite run offense, not great defense, not a great recruiting program, not a portal program, not a high scoring program, not a great, they don't really have an identity. And I don't think there's really that much reason for excitement coming into this year. Penn State, in my opinion, there should be a ton of excitement about them. Remember, coming off that Rose Bowl win, I know everybody wants to criticize James Franklin. Everybody hates James Franklin. But the bottom line is, you go back to last year, they largely took care of business, largely beat everybody that they were supposed to, had the lead going into the fourth quarter against Ohio State, and finished 11-2. They finished 11-2, only losses at Michigan, Ohio State at home, and they won the Rose Bowl. Now, 2 great running backs coming back, Nicholas Singleton, Katron Allen. Also, great offensive line, great defensive line. This team has a chance to be really good. I would lean Penn State in this game, but they're going to be a fun team to monitor over the course of the year. It would not shock me. I'm not saying this is my official pick on June 26, 2023. Would not shock me to see them win the Big Ten for the second time under James Franklin. All right. In typical AT fashion, this segment is going long. So let's go ahead and wrap on. Listen, let me just say this. There is one game that is bigger than all the other games in week 1 in college football. And this is a game, I think you can argue, this is the game I might be most excited about, period, in college football. Forget week 1. Period in college football. That game is LSU versus Florida State in Orlando on the Sunday night of Labor Day weekend. Remember, that Labor Day weekend, we always, most people have off that Monday. So we have a full slate on Saturday. Then we have the Sunday game and the Monday game. The Monday game this year is Clemson at Duke. Not breaking down Duke's too deep right now, although they were very improved under Mike Elko last year. So let's close on LSU in Florida against Florida State. LSU is currently a 2.5-point favorite in the Betfred Sportsbook. Florida State won this game last year in New Orleans on the same Sunday night. And this is going to be a fascinating game. Both teams, I believe, are going to start the year in the top 10. Both teams, I believe, are good enough to make the college football playoff. And LSU is obviously fascinating in its own perspective. Beats Alabama last year. Remember, it was this game. They lose week 1 to Florida State. And, Brian Kelly's in over his head, and, he's got no shot. And then they slowly start building back. All of a sudden, a 10-win season, they beat Alabama, and there's some really excitement coming into 2023. From LSU's perspective, they really got it all. Unlike pretty much everybody in the SEC. Remember, Georgia started breaking in a new quarterback. Alabama's breaking in a new quarterback. Tennessee's breaking in a new quarterback. Florida's breaking in a new quarterback. You go on and on down the list. LSU is returning Jaden Daniels, who has Heisman potential this season. Leading rusher a year ago, obviously a great passer, and he brings back most of his skill position talent around him. Malik Neighbors, elite wide receiver. Mason Taylor, the son of Jason Taylor at tight end. And then on defense, Harold Perkins is elite, probably a top 5 pick in the 2020, I guess it would be 2025 NFL draft because he's only in his sophomore year. And then Mason Smith is probably a first-round pick this year, was injured for most of last year. Same time, as intriguing as LSU is, I think you can legitimately argue that Florida State is maybe the most intriguing team in all of college football. Remember, they beat LSU to open last year. They have a 3-game losing streak in the middle of the year, and then win 6 straight to close last season, destroyed Miami in that rivalry game. Won against Oklahoma in the bowl game. And really, it built momentum going into this season, coming off a 10-win season. But more importantly, they return a ton. 16 starters overall. Most notably, Jordan Travis, their quarterback, really came on strong late last season. 24 touchdowns, 5 interceptions. Completion percentage is up to 64%. That's probably the thing I'd say he needs to work on the most. And then they return Jared Verse, probably a top 20 or so NFL draft pick, could have gone pro, decides to come back. And then Florida State just crushed in the portal. They added a bunch of guys along the D-line. They added an offensive tackle from UTEP. Jonah Byers, one of the guys that was most coveted in the portal. They added Ventrell Cypress, all ACC cornerback from Virginia. And most recently, they added Keon Coleman, the leading wide receiver from Michigan State. Florida State is one of the most intriguing teams in college football to me. I would lean Florida State plus 2.5 in this game. But when I tell you that is a game, circle it on the calendar. Tell your family we ain't going out Sunday night of Labor Day weekend. Honey, I can tell you it's not even July 4th yet. Week 1 college football point spreads, week 1 college football bets. Boy, oh boy, it is coming quick. I'll tell you this. We're like 3 weeks away from SEC Media Days, and then it is officially go time. All right, so what I want to do, take a quick break, and when I come back, we are going to switch gears back to basketball, okay? So on Sunday, put out a little tweet, just dip my toe in the water. And I said, guys, girls, people who follow me, who is the best coach in college basketball right now? I get asked that question all the time. And so what I want to do, take a quick break, come back. I want to read some of your responses, and I want to share my opinion. Who is the best coach in college basketball? Quick break. Be right back. All right, we're getting back to the show in a minute. But before we do, I want to welcome back our presenting sponsor, Betfred Sportsbook and the Betfred Sportsbook app. The NBA playoffs are here, and nobody has you covered quite like Betfred. By now, you know Betfred's story. Started in 1967 in the UK. Over 1,200 shops in the UK. They have since come to the United States and made a major splash. They are not only the presenting sponsor of the Aaron Torres podcast and all things Aaron Torres media, but also the Cincinnati Bengals, the Colorado Rockies, the Denver Broncos. And what I love about Betfred Sportsbook is that nobody takes care of their customers quite like Betfred. You've seen the Betfred Sportsbook suite at Bengals games. It is hopping. We have sent listeners of this show to Denver Broncos VIP tailgates. Betfred bettors have thrown out first pitches at Colorado Rockies games. Again, nobody takes care of you like Betfred Sportsbook does, and here is what they are doing for the NBA playoffs. How about this for a deal? Bet $50 on any game all playoffs long, get up to $1,111 in free bets. Here's how it works. Download the Betfred Sportsbook app, bet $50 on any game. You automatically get $111 in free bets. But beyond that, here is what else Betfred does for you. They're going to give you up to $200 in insurance for the first 5 weeks that you're a Betfred customer. So maybe you make a bad pick. We all do. We've all been there. Trust me, you followed my picks in March Madness. It happens. So you bet 200, doesn't work out, get 200 insurance for the first 5 weeks that you are a Betfred customer, equating up to $1,111 in free bets thanks to Betfred. Again, nobody takes care of you like Betfred does. Love working with them. They are the presenting sponsor of the Aaron Torres pod. Tell them Torres sent you. Download the Betfred Sportsbook app right now. All right, everybody. I am back. Gonna be back. Do want to switch gears. And so here's the deal with what we're going to do right now. Obviously, we just did a ton of football, but I do want to switch gears to basketball because I still think there's some fun basketball conversations that we can have, especially this time of year. And what's fun about this time of year is that it allows kind of me to kind of just hit on topics and conversations that I normally wouldn't be able to do. I get asked questions all the time, or there's an interesting thing that like live golf. I wouldn't normally talk about live golf on this show, especially if it was like October and Michigan was playing Penn State next week, right? I wouldn't be talking about live golf if it was March and we had a bracket in front of us. But I can talk live golf in the spring, in the summer, etc. And so I bring it up because there's topics that I get to hit on and there's conversations that I get to have this time of year that I just would not be able to otherwise. And I get to answer a lot of the questions that I get asked throughout the year. And one of the questions that I get asked more than pretty much any other is, Torres, who do you believe is the best coach in college basketball right now? And if you had to do a ranking right now, this second, of your best coaches, what would it be and why? And so what I want to do over the next few minutes is not so much give out my ranking, because what happened this weekend is something interesting. I thought about this question. I was starting to put together my list, and then I decided to put out the question on Twitter and got some very interesting responses. Got about 50 responses in total. And so what I want to do is go through my list, but also go through your guys and girls' responses and kind of intermingle them to kind of put together the general who is the best coach in college basketball list. I will share mine, but I'll also share some of your comments as well. So let's get to the list. Number one, in my opinion, was a no-brainer, and it seems as though most of you agree. Number one, in my opinion, is Bill Self, and the overwhelming number of tweets that I got when I put this question out support that just about everybody believes Bill Self is the best coach in college basketball right now. Here are some responses that I got from you guys and girls. Jason, regular listener of the show, is a Kentucky fan, readily admitted. As much as I hate to say it, it's Bill Self. Alan said it's Bill Self, and I believe it's by a comfortable margin. Micah said Bill Self is killing it right now. And then we got another response that said it's probably Bill Self, always has one of the best teams in the country, but when you look at his recruiting, he's not pulling in the talent Calipari is. He's got a great system and develops his players. And so really, most of your guys and girls' response is very similar to how I feel about Bill Self. First of all, maybe more than anybody else in college basketball right now, he checks all three of those boxes: regular season success, postseason success, NCAA tournament success, conference tournament success. You look at his regular season resume. I mean, it is unbelievable at this point. Obviously, the 2 national championships speak for themselves. I believe right now he and Pitino are the only 2 coaches with multiple national championships. Billy Donovan, I guess, would count 2. He's active, just not in college basketball. So you have the 2 national championships. But this is the stat that's kind of stunning. 17 Big 12 regular season titles. I mean, that is freaking insane when you think about it. When you think about 17 Big 12 regular season titles, all since 2005 or so, I believe, if my math is correct. That probably isn't right because that's like 18 years total. So he's got 17 regular season titles. And what's especially impressive about that is, again, the short window in which he's done it. For fun, I went back and looked it up. How about this? Coach K, who was at Duke for 42 years. Everybody considers him the GOAT. 13 regular season titles. Bill Self has 17 already, and he's obviously not done coaching. To me, though, what makes Bill Self the best, in my opinion, is exactly what that last tweet said. Always has one of the best teams in the country, but when you look at his recruiting, he's not pulling in the talent that others are. And that, to me, is the most interesting thing about Bill Self. I know I said last week, Dan Hurley had some of those comments about Calipari, or, I don't know if he said it about Calipari, but Dan Hurley had the comments, we don't just bring in one and dones, we develop guys, etc. And Bill Self is very much the same. You could argue Bill Self's most disappointing teams are when he has his highest ranked recruits. Didn't have success with Andrew Wiggins. Didn't have success with Kelly Oubre. Didn't have success with Xavier Henry, if you remember that name, a top 5 prospect once upon a time. His best teams 2 years ago won a national championship. Best players, Christian Brown and Ochai Agbaji, both late first-round picks, both multi-year college players that were developed internally. Final Four in 2012, Thomas Robinson was his best player. Third, fourth-year college player who had redshirted at the time. National championship team. Best player was what? Probably Mario Chalmers, longtime NBA journeyman, but not a superstar, not a one-and-done, etc. Has had success with guys like Devontae Graham, Frank Mason, etc. And so to me, Bill Self is the easy answer. Consistent, excellent in the regular season, conference tournaments, NCAA tournament. And again, great eye for talent, great developer of talent. And it goes without saying. He's got Hunter Dickinson this year. He ain't slowing down anytime soon. The number 2 response, I would say on this list, and it was actually probably the number 2 on my list as well. It's going to be a little bit controversial, but I am going to say it anyway. Number 2 on this list is probably Mark Few, Gonzaga. And I already know people, he's never won a national championship, and he plays in the easiest conference in college basketball, and blah, 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 blah. Okay, let me start by saying this. If you think Mark Few is overrated, at this point, I'm not going to convince you otherwise. What I would say, though, is yes, the conference is not, right now as we record, a power conference. The level of play is not the same as the Big 12 or the Big East or the SEC or the ACC or whatever. But they do still schedule very toughly, and they do win a lot of games against a lot of really good teams. Remember, it was last year in Spokane, smacked Kentucky around, smacked Duke when they had Zion Williamson. I believe Duke only lost like 2 games that year or 3 games when Zion Williamson was fully healthy. Gonzaga was one of them. Took care of North Carolina a few years ago when North Carolina came to the kennel. So you go on and on down the list. They play great competition in the regular season, have great success, and they have great postseason success as well. I know that the NCAA tournament isn't a be-all, end-all, but they are now, how about this? 8 straight NCAA tournaments making at least the second weekend of the NCAA tournament. So 8 straight tournaments dating back to 2015. There was no tournament in 2020. And the last 8, they have made at least the Sweet 16, and they have made 4 Elite Eights over that stretch. 4 Elite Eights in the last 8 years, 2 Final Fours, 2 national championship games, and I get it. They have not won the big one yet, but a couple things. 1, just because you haven't won it yet doesn't mean you can't. And 2, like we have to talk about mitigating factors here, right? 2021, they were dominant. They were by far the second best team in college basketball. And it just so happened that they ran into a juggernaut in Baylor who ended up winning the national championship. Maybe things go a little, I always say this, it's not an excuse. They're the second best team. Baylor was better. But how often do the 2 best teams even play in the championship game, let alone 1 versus 2? Baylor dominates that. They deserve to win. I'd also add, like, 2020, when the tournament was canceled, Gonzaga was going to be a number 1 seed. I believe had a team good enough to win it. So Mark Few is very high on my list, very high on a lot of people's lists. I got a great tweet about Mark Few. He said, taking Gonzaga, this is from a Gonzaga fan, taking Gonzaga to 2 Final Fours as a mid-major and building the most stable and consistent program outside of the Power 5 in the last 20 years. Nobody has even come close. I agree with that. The only thought on Mark Few that is worth noting is this. Did he already miss his window for best opportunities? Because it is worth noting, and I've talked about it on this show before. The talent level at Gonzaga has not been the same since Tommy Lloyd left a few years ago. Tommy Lloyd is obviously the current head coach at Arizona. That international pipeline has essentially dried up. Gonzaga will not have a single international player on their roster this year, I believe. Arizona is going to have about 5 or 6. And obviously, look, the talent level just isn't the same. So we'll see if Gonzaga can remain at that level. Good news is they did well in the portal. But Mark Few right now, I believe, deserves to be in the conversation, probably behind Bill Self, right up there, number 2, number 3 overall. I would say outside of Bill Self, in terms of number 1. Now, a couple people listed their top 3, 4, 5. Mark Few is in a lot of them. Number 2, I would say that the person that got the most first place votes outside of Bill Self, he's a guy that we're very familiar with on this podcast. We call him Big Rick Energy. Rick Pitino got a lot of votes at number 1. Here's what Rick Burkhardt said. Rick Pitino, as long as Rick Pitino is coaching a college team, he's the best out there. Multiple people, one-word answers. It's Pitino, Pitino this, Pitino that. But Rick Pitino got a lot of votes in that top number 1 spot. But besides Bill Self, like I said, I think he probably got the most votes. In terms of Rick Pitino, listen, if you want to say he's the best coach in college basketball, I'm not going to argue with it. And it's a lot of the reason why I'm so excited to see him at St. John's. This is a guy that for literally 40 years, everywhere he goes, he wins and he wins big. The guy won at Providence. Remember, he took Providence to a Final Four, built some of the greatest teams of the modern era at Kentucky. The 96 team is maybe the best college basketball team I've ever seen. 10 deep, destroyed just about everybody, beat, ironically, John Calipari and UMass in the Final Four, beat Syracuse in the title game. The 98 team, Rick Pitino leaves, they still make the title game. That's how good Rick Pitino had things rolling at Kentucky. 96 win the title, 97 national runners-up, 98 they win it even after he's gone. Don't want to discredit Tubby Smith in any way, shape, or form, but it just shows you. Then he goes to the NBA, goes to Louisville, wins a national title there, sort of, that we can't acknowledge, but we know it happened. And I think it's worth noting. Got to Iona, and in 3 seasons, made 2 NCAA tournaments and won the league title all 3 times in the regular season. You give him he's probably the guy that if you just give him a program, a blank slate from scratch, from the beginning, and just say, next year we need to win a ton of games, he's probably number 1 on that list. So Rick Pitino gets a lot of votes. And again, this is why I'm so excited about what he's doing at St. John's. In one offseason, probably built a top 25 team, and I can't wait to see what he does in year 2, year 3, year 4. Rick Pitino coming in with probably the second most first place votes behind Bill Self. A couple other names that came up that I found interesting. One, we did get one very passionate vote for Tom Izzo. Breezy, who isn't a Michigan State fan, says Izzo has been successful forever. He always seems to make the most out of his potential of his teams, and he's still at his age where he's recruiting well. And oh, by the way, he's going to have a Final Four caliber team this year. Izzo's an interesting one because I do give him credit. He's been around essentially forever, and they really are still rolling. They're going to go into the season with a top 10 team, the Big Ten favorite, good enough to win a national championship. But he is also a guy that over the years, remember, his first Final Four was all the way back in 1999, okay? So he's had Final Four caliber teams for now close to 25 years. 99 was so long ago. In that Final Four, they played Elton Brand and Duke. Elton Brand now retired from the NBA. Rip Hamilton was in that Final Four. It was a long time ago. And so I bring it up because Izzo has been around forever, and the stats back it up as well. 8 Final Fours total as recently as 2019. Much like I said about Gonzaga, and it is worth noting about Kansas as well. Izzo had a team good enough to win it all in 2020 as well. That was the Cassius Winston team. Only thing I'd say about Izzo, last couple of years have sort of been a struggle. 2021, that was the COVID bubble year. Play-in game, lost in the play-in to UCLA. 2022, lost in the second round to Duke. This year, they did make the Sweet 16, of course, but again, next year we'll have a team good enough to win it. A couple other names that came up. I saw this one. I thought it was very interesting. I was a little surprised, but I actually had a few people make the case for John Calipari. And at first, I didn't know if it was sarcasm or mean-spirited or whatever. but a couple people did. Here was an interesting quote that I thought was interesting. Somebody said, I'm going to say Cal. The entire point of college is to prepare you for your career. And the insinuation, obviously, is that nobody prepares NBA players better than Cal. And so what I'll say is there's a little bit of an anti-Cal narrative right now that's starting to kind of balance itself out, of course, because of the fact that the program is starting to get it back on its feet after a tough spring. I find that conversation really interesting, though, because I know this is a very divisive conversation, right? Is a college basketball coach's job to win games for college or to develop his players as best as they can for real life? And in the case of Kentucky's players, it's for the NBA. Now, I still think it's to prepare players for college or to win at the highest level of college. But you can argue that from about 2009 to 2019, nobody was better at developing NBA players while also winning at the college level than Kentucky. And I know it's easy to criticize the last few years, but I go back to what I've said pretty consistently the last month or so. 2022, they were a top 10 team all year, number 2 seed, was way up on St. Peter's, ended up losing in overtime. They beat St. Peter's. They're playing Murray State to go to the Sweet 16. And then from there, we see what happens. This past year, it was disappointment, but there was a lot of injuries. I'm not making excuses. These are just facts. Case and Wallace missed games. Jacob Toppin missed games. Oscar Tshiebwe had surgery right before the season. So I don't think Cal can be number 1, but I still think even at his advanced age, probably not as far down the list as people think. A couple votes for Calipari. Got a couple for Kelvin Sampson. Got a couple for Scott Drew. And in an interesting twist, we actually got a couple for Dan Hurley. I had Sidelines UConn, somebody I know pretty well, said, the coach I want today and going forward is Dan Hurley. He killed it this season and is spitting hot as a recruiter. VT UConn fan club says, keep underestimating Hurley, folks. We like that. Don't think you can put Hurley at number 1 at this point, but he does bring up kind of an interesting second tier, right? It's who's number 1 right now. Is it Bill Self? Is it Mark Few? Is it Pitino? But then, oh, by the way, if you start talking about who do I want over the next 10 years in college basketball, that's an interesting conversation. Is it Dan Hurley with the national championship? Is it Nate Oates with a pair of SEC titles? Is it Eric Musselman? Is it Tommy Lloyd at Arizona? I think you can make an argument for as well. Back-to-back Pac-12 tournament titles, all that good stuff. Maybe that's the conversation that we have next. Who do you want over the next 10 years? Is it Dan Hurley? Is it Nate Oates? Is it Lloyd? Is it Muss? Is it whoever? But right now, my top 4 in college basketball, I actually agree with most of the answers. Bill Self 1, Pitino 2, Mark Few 3. I would go Kelvin Sampson 4. All right, so what I want to do, take a quick break, come back, and when we come back, name that is not on that list of top college basketball coaches, it is Bob Huggins. He is out at West Virginia. They have named their replacement, but is it too late? Have they lost their best players to the portal? Going to discuss that next. All right, everybody. I am back. Gonna be back. Final segment of the show. So good to be back. And I do want to go ahead and wrap with what is probably the biggest story in college sports still, one that we finally got a resolution to this weekend, and that is the situation with West Virginia basketball. By now, you don't need me to tell you everything that's happened over the last couple weeks. Bob Huggins gets a DUI 2 Fridays ago. Bob Huggins resigns on Saturday. And then from there, the question becomes what happens next at West Virginia. Now, if you listen to this show, you know darn well what I've said from the beginning about the situation at West Virginia. I said, look, I believe you need to name an interim coach immediately if you are the West Virginia Mountaineers, which went exactly counter to what West Virginia decided to do. And the reason I said you need to name an interim head coach is pretty straightforward. One, it's because it's going to be basically impossible to find a single qualified candidate to actually come and take the job at this time on the calendar. The bottom line is it is June. Okay. It is in the new world of college basketball. It's actually a very important time. Now, maybe if this was 10 years ago, 8 years ago, 30 years ago, it's a different conversation. But now, remember, coaches actually can conduct practices in the summer. You weren't able to do that until about 5 or 6 years ago. And so you spend all spring recruiting a portal class, getting kids committed to your program, bringing kids in, bringing them onto campus. And now you're actually working with them. Now you're communicating with them. Now you can't sneak out the side door to take another head coaching job. And so I said, I just don't believe you're going to be able to get very good candidates at this time. And also on top of that, it is important for you to make this move now to hold a very good roster together. I said it a few weeks ago. I said, I believe that West Virginia has a top 25 caliber roster thanks to the number of players that they brought in through the transfer portal this offseason. But the longer you wait, the more questions they have, the more concerns they have, the more other people get in their ears, the more that they decide to go ahead and make decisions where they might not be staying at your school. And so I bring it up because on Saturday night, West Virginia made the only sensible decision they could, as they named Josh Eilert their lead assistant, their interim head coach. And as I just said, I should basically be running a college sports consulting service because this is what I said should happen. And oh, by the way, the question now, can Josh Eilert do enough to retain this roster that, as I said, I believe is a top 25 team in college basketball? What's interesting about this, it is that when the decision was made on Saturday, West Virginia basically confirmed exactly what I said a week ago. Again, I should be running a consulting firm. Here is a direct quote from Ren Baker about the decision. He said, I spoke with knowledgeable basketball people around the country over the last week, including coaches, professional basketball executives, and others of whom I trust to identify a strong group of candidates to speak with. Ultimately, what I came to recognize was that conducting this search in late June was difficult for many of our candidates, and it also put our talented student athletes at a real disadvantage. With that said, we will conduct our national search at the conclusion of the 2023-2024 season. So, hey, that second to last sentence, that was basically ripped right from the Aaron Torres pod a week ago. The sentence was, what I ultimately came to recognize was that conducting this search in late June was difficult for many of our candidates, Torres told you, and also put our talented student athletes at a real disadvantage. No, it put your new coaching staff at a disadvantage to retain them, and that is why the decision was made. My concern, though, going forward, so first of all, I'm not going to crush West Virginia. I think they made the decision that was right for them and the decision that needed to be made, that needed to be done. I guess my only question now, is it too late? Because on Friday, West Virginia had 3 players that I would consider starting caliber players decide to enter the transfer portal, and I believe that's what expedited this process. Essentially, as the AD said, he could not get real candidates to even interview for this job, let alone take it. But what I believe really kind of made this decision for him is that the bottom line remains is that the longer he waited, the more likely it was that players were going to enter the portal and leave. And so that was why the decision was made, because 3 players on Friday decided to enter the portal. Now, the good news is, here's the good news. Good news is maybe the most important player to enter the portal already announced that he's coming back. So this is as of Sunday afternoon. Now, stuff is going to change. Stuff could change. Stuff will change. But West Virginia got great news on Sunday night when Kirk Risa, the starting point guard from Arizona, who had entered the portal on Friday, announced that he was going to come back. This is great news. This is why you hire the interim head coach from the previous staff. All of these players committed to play for Bob Huggins. All of these players have a relationship with this current staff, and all of them are going to try to piece together this season together. But this is why you don't bring in an outside voice. Josh Eilert is the head coach. Josh Eilert is the interim. He understands it's only for this year. But now Kirk Risa, who maybe this is his last year in college basketball, he does have additional eligibility. He has the comfort of knowing that he's coming back. And I think that's really important for West Virginia. This is a guy, he is the starting point guard. And listen, I get that in college basketball circles, he's a little bit of a controversial player, if you will. Not a great NBA player. I know he struggled in big time games, especially in the NCAA tournament, but this is also a very good college basketball player. 9.9 points per game, just under 10 points per game, just under double digits at Arizona last year. And then also led the Pac-12 in assists. So we could talk about limitations. We could talk about what he's capable of. We could talk about what he's not capable of. But the bottom line was, this is a cornerstone guy for the 2023-2024 Mountaineers. You needed him back. If he was in the portal and he transferred, you're screwed. You can't find a replacement for him this year. What gets much more interesting to me, though, what happens with the other 2 players that decided to enter the portal on Friday. The first one is a guy that I think you could be in trouble and may have already lost. That is Trey Mitchell, a forward who was a starter actually on last year's team. He wasn't part of the transfer group that was so successful this year. But 6'9" forward from the city of Pittsburgh. He is returning for a second year, averaged just under 12 points and 5.5 rebounds per game. He entered the portal on Friday, and why I would be concerned. He has already been linked to the University of Kentucky, and there's a chance that Kentucky might swoop in under the cloak of darkness and get this guy before you can even have a chance to convince him not to leave campus. For people who don't know much about Trey Mitchell, kind of an interesting player. Former top 100 recruit from Pittsburgh, as I said, actually started his career at UMass, was a really good player in the A10, and then kind of in that 2021 offseason when the portal was open and everybody was kind of looking at their options, decides to go to Texas. He ends up ultimately deciding to go to Texas for a year. It doesn't work out. He leaves in the middle of the season, but he really seems to have found a home at West Virginia over the last year or so. 12 points per game, 5.5 rebounds per game, a pretty good three-point shooter, 36%. And so I just bring it up because this is why you could not wait. Guess what? He already visited Kentucky this weekend. As I record here, no official decision has been made, but this was the problem when you waited a week and a week to 10 days to make the final decision. Guys have options, guys make decisions, guys make other visits. Now the question is, does Trey Mitchell go to Kentucky? And I'll be honest, right now, if I had to guess, and it's always subject to change, I could finish recording here and in 10 minutes, he could reaffirm his commitment to West Virginia. I think he's going to end up at Kentucky. Family has ties to John Calipari, takes a visit right away. I could see him committing pretty quickly. And then finally, the last player that did end up ultimately entering the portal is another one that, oh, by the way, is seriously considering other options, and that's Joe Toussaint. For people who don't know, Joe Toussaint, guard, veteran player, played 3 years at Iowa, played last year at West Virginia, 9.5 points per game, 2.5 assists per game, and just a really good college basketball player. Veteran guard. I believe he would help any team in college basketball that would have him. And I believe he told John Rothstein, as of Saturday night, I'm still keeping my options open. I'm still seeing what else is out there. And again, another player that you could potentially lose. What will be most interesting going forward? Do any of those other big-time West Virginia players consider their options? Obviously, Jesse Edwards, all ACC forward who transferred in from Syracuse, averaged like just under 15 points, 12 rebounds, 3 blocks per game. One of the elite defensive players in college basketball. He could enter the portal. Raekwon Battle, 18.8 points per game at Montana State this past year, led them to the NCAA tournament. He could enter the portal. And Jose Perez, former MAC player of the year at Manhattan. We'll see what happens with those guys. Hopefully West Virginia is able to retain them. But I believe because of the hesitancy, they could lose 1 and maybe 2 players going forward. It'll be interesting to see if anybody else seriously considers leaving. All right, I think that's it for this episode of the Aaron Torres Sports Podcast. It is time for me to get out of here. If you're not subscribed to the podcast, please make sure to do so. Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, Google Music, wherever you listen to podcasts, make sure that you are subscribed. Also, make sure to rate and review the show. Go ahead, give us a quick 5 stars. Let us know what you like, what you don't like, all that good stuff. Make sure you're following on social media at Aaron_Torres on Twitter, at Aaron Torres Pod on Instagram, Aaron Torres Podcast Questions at gmail.com. Aaron Torres Podcast Questions at gmail.com. That is all for today's show. It is time for me to get out of here. And I hope everybody has a great Monday and Tuesday. I'll be back Wednesday. Shout out to Torrent Craig. Shout out to Rachel, who hates my voice. Shout out to JJ Redick, you F-head. Unblock me, bro. I'll be back Wednesday. New episode, Aaron Torres Pod.